Hi, and welcome to our last lecture of the semester. There's a lot of slides in this presentation. A lot of them are images, though, and I'll just kind of zip through them. So a lot to talk about, and this is a very important lecture, especially for those of you who are close to your capstone. If you're at the beginning of the program, maybe not so much. Maybe this is something you'll want to put away and hold on to for later, these slides. But if you're close to capstone, this could be a very useful discussion. So our discussion today is completing the capstone report. Before we get into the details, I wanted to really talk about the two different kinds of capstones we have here at in the MSA program. MSA600 is fairly new. We just started it. Really, it's only been in place for about a year, and I actually get to teach that class. Unfortunately, I can't teach 600, this class, and 699 because they're afraid that I'll, there's, some reason for me, if I teach you 600, to let you slack off in 699, which I don't understand. But anyway, that's the rule. So, but my wife does teach 699, so she tells me what's going on very often with her students. So we have these two capstone classes, and the question you should have is, what's the difference between the two? Which one should I take? And the answer is, well, it depends. I'm agnostic here. I don't favor one over the other. I think they're both very good classes and, practical ways for you to get to the end of your program. Both are only 3 credits. Both are 16 weeks long, 15 weeks in the summer. So let's talk about these two capstone classes. First, we'll talk about the newer one, the 698, Directed Administrative Portfolio. So in 698, as your last class, you're really asked to go back to your core courses and your notes from your core courses and write a series of 5 papers over the semester. Now, remember, it's 16 weeks, right? So that's about 1 paper every 3 weeks, right? Each paper is 10 to 12 pages, not counting the front and back matter. And so you've got to produce one of these every 3 weeks. Knowing that you need to use the writing center, you can't wait until the last week to write it. You kind of got to write it in like maybe the end of the second week, beginning of the third week, so you have enough time to get it to the writing center. But the way this course proceeds is at the beginning of the course, you identify a research topic. It has to be related to your concentration. When I teach it, it has to be related to a specific organization, either one that you work for now or one that you worked for in the past. And so the problem that you're studying has to be related to your concentration and related to an organization you currently or have prior worked for. Once your topic is approved, then you proceed, right? The first paper you write is 603 Strategic Planning paper. So if you haven't had 603 yet, you'll take it. And you really talk about business strategies and organizations, how to do SWOT analyses, corporate strategies. And you talk about a lot of different things about strategy. And so in that paper, you take your issue, your problem that you're studying, and you look at it from a strategic perspective. How is it impacting the organization? What are the big issues? What are the strategic issues related to the problem I'm studying? Then you, after 3 weeks, you finish that paper, you move to your next paper, which is your org behavior, your human factors and org theory. And you look at things like communication, leadership, morale, interaction, power, and all those things that you study in 601, and you look at those aspects of the problem. And then in 604, you look at multiculturalism and globalization, which covers a lot of the similar issues to 601, leadership, etc., often from a multicultural perspective. And then finally, your last paper, when I teach it, is your financial paper, where you have to take your issue and look at the implications. How much is it costing the organization? If we're going to solve it, what's it going to cost us to solve it? What are the budget implications? Once you finish those 4 papers over a series of weeks, and remember that's producing a 10 to 12 page paper every 3 weeks, edited, ready to be graded. Then you write a 5th paper based on your previous 4, which really pulls from those papers, and it summarizes all these different angles on the problem, draws conclusions, which means answers to questions, and then you make recommendations. It's more structured, 698, than 699. It has very rigid due dates. In my class, I take off 5 points for 1 day, 10 points for 2 days, 15 points for 3 days late, and then 0 after that. And there's no exceptions, none. And so it's a very rigid format, and most instructors are teaching it that way. And so I would say that class, you have to be very disciplined, you have to roll, get things done, be very aggressive. If you have writing issues, there's a ton of writing in that class, so you have to be careful not to stumble over your writing issues, and you have to use your writing center and other editing resources and get things edited. Each paper has to include scholarly literature from the library and actual organizational data and facts from the organization. So it looks a little bit like the study that we've been looking at this semester. If you write well, you're willing to write 55 pages or so over 16 weeks. You feel comfortable doing literature, and you feel comfortable enough to do the accounting and finance, which you learned in MSA601, you should not have a problem. You should jump into 698. I do want to caution you that all the work you're doing this semester cannot be used in 698. My wife taught a 698 recently, and she had 2 students who were like shocked and dismayed that they couldn't use their 600 proposal that you're writing this semester for the 698 class. But you can't. It doesn't relate. This class comes at the issue from a core course perspective, not from a research perspective. So don't be shocked. You have to write 5 papers from scratch, pretty much, but it's a very structured course, and you're not going to get waylaid by your own personal life, because you're going to have to get this done over 16 weeks. So that's 698. 699 is called Applied Research Project Administration. My wife teaches that class. I can't teach it. I teach the 698 class. But if you do well in this class, MSA600, and you wind up with a solid proposal, which you will because you have me, and you're certain that you can get permission to collect your data from your organization, then 699 might work for you. But you actually have to finish up whatever you start in your proposal this semester, or you can write a new proposal if you want. It's not a problem. So in 699, you get your proposal approved by whoever your instructor is in that class, because it wouldn't be me. And if you do okay in this class, you're probably going to have a proposal. Most instructors like to get my 600 students. Then you fill out a form, and you give your consent forms and your survey, that's your appendices from your proposal, and you send them to your instructor, and she or he sends them to Central Michigan MSA department, and then you get permission to collect data. So then you give out your surveys, and you conduct your interviews, you get the data back. And once your stuff comes back, you write Chapter 4, Data Analysis, which is about 8 to 10 pages. And then you take your literature, Chapter 2, and your data analysis, Chapter 4, and you write Chapter 5, which is a summary of Chapters 2 and 4. Conclusions, which is the answers to the research questions based on the facts, and recommendations. Generally, Chapter 5 runs about 5, 6 pages, maybe 8 pages, but no more. Then you add an executive summary, which is no more than 2 pages. You also go back to the proposal format, where everything says, we'll give out the survey, and you say, gave out the survey, and expected 100 responses, got 90 responses. So you go back and you change chapters 1 through to past tense. So there's less writing in 699, but you need to have your proposal approved. Your 699 instructor has approved your topic and your proposal. You have to get permission to collect data. You're probably only going to write about 20, 25 pages. But there's less structure. You need to really be self-motivated. Hold yourself to a strict schedule. If you can't do that, then take 698. Due to lack of rigid structure, procrastinators tend to have problems in 699. But if you're gung-ho and you want to finish in 8, 9 weeks instead of 16 weeks, and you get fire, as you say, fire in the belly, desire, burning desire, and you're willing to have your writing edited, then 699 might work for you. So I think you're all talented enough to succeed in either format. You just need to know what you're getting into. You need to know that you can't use the proposal from this class in 698. But if you take 699, you probably would use it. But if you can't get permission to collect your data from your organization, you can't get a permission letter, you can't use it anyway. So, it's kind of like a round circle. So let me plow through the rest of this and tell you about writing your final research report. Once we get to the stage, we stop saying proposal. We're not proposing anything. We're writing a final research report. So everything's past tense. It's a completed study. So it did, it had, but there's no wills in there. The wills are gone. And so you can see with the big circle here, that's your proposal we wrote this semester. But down below is what we're talking about today, 4 and 5, 3, 4, and 5. So final research report. A final research report, you go back and you change your proposal to past tense, and then you write your final research report, Chapter 4, Data Analysis, Chapter 5, Summary, Conclusion, and Recommendations. You add executive summary, and then you provide it to senior leadership, right? So that's what we're talking about in this lecture here. So moving from a proposal or a plan to a final report. A proposal was a plan. in future tense. After the proposal is approved, you don't need it anymore. It's done. So you make a copy of the proposal, you modify the copy, and you change it. You go through and you change everything to past tense because stuff's finished, right? Data is collected, right? And the study has been done. It's no longer will be. So what do you need to change? The front matter, cover page. There's a whole different format. I'll show you in a second. You add executive summary at the end after you've written Chapter 5, because really your executive summary kind of comes from Chapter 5. You modify your table contents to be complete. You modify your tables and figures if you've written your Chapter 4. So that's what you have to do. This is the format for a final research report. It's different, right? It says down the bottom, submitted in partial fulfillment of requirements. If I get a final report from a student and it doesn't say submitted in partial fulfillment, I just jump on it. It just needs to be done. So this is all the stuff you need to change, right? I'm just going to flip through this. Chapter 1, you don't include the word will. Chapter 2, in your literature, you probably have to expand it for your capstone class because you did 6 or 7 pages in this class. They usually want 12 to 15 in a capstone format. I've talked before about the time issues. In expository writing, we're really not going to say will. You're not going to just use the will word anywhere. Maybe there's something in your report where it's still going to be done. Will be presented to leadership. Okay, you could leave it there. But most cases, you change everything to past tense. Chapter 3, you basically rewrite for the final report. You go back and you say surveys were used, 100 surveys were given out, 80 were returned. And so Chapter 3 changes from what you plan to do to what actually occurred. And you might need to update your limitations as it says here. Other things to check in a final report versus the proposal is your references. Your appendices need to be all squared away. So let's talk about writing Chapter 4, okay? Because that's what you would have to do. You don't have to do that this semester. I'm not asking you to do Chapter 4. But Chapter 4 is analyzing the data. Now, I spent a lot of time just last summer. This is 2018, but I spent time in 2017 significantly enhancing the proposal template. It used to be called a proposal template, and I renamed it to be the proposal and final report template. And where I made the most changes in the template was Chapter 4. And the reason I did that was students really seemed to struggle with how to write Chapter 4. So the template, this is really stuff that you're seeing now is coming from the template, right? So analyze the data. Before writing Chapter 4, do these things. Organize and aggregate the data. Enter the data into Excel so you can create charts and tables. Do your quantitative analysis. Calculate your mean, your standard deviation for your Likert questions. You're not going to be using qualitative data as we learned last week. You're going to align the results. When you write Chapter 4, you're going to align the questions with research questions, because that's what purpose Chapter 4 is. How does the data answer the research questions? How can the responses be explained? What do the responses suggest in terms of the research questions? Then you write Chapter 4. You develop an effective transition from the first 3 chapters. You develop a chapter structure focused on answering the research questions. You describe your data. That's in tables and charts. Tables and charts do not go as appendices. They go right, this is a test question. They do not go as in appendices. They go right in Chapter 4 because you don't want your reader to have to flip back and forth. It's crazy. Explain the responses and their contribution to answering the research questions, and you write Chapter 4 summary. Have your Chapter 4 edited, and then you're all set, right? And then in terms of, these are just details about what we just said, and I'm going to fly through these because there's a lot of slides here, so watch me fly through these. Organizing and aggregating the data. For surveys, note the number distributed and the number returned. Identify incomplete surveys. You throw them out if they're incomplete, usually, because you don't want any bias, and you only want people who gave you all the answers. Interviews and focus groups, note the number of interviews done, review your notes and fix any issues with eligible writing. Then you're going to do some content analysis on those interviews. System of records or other original data source, note the number of records examined, identify any that are incomplete, should not be included. Financial data or other content for pro forma estimates, organize as revenue and expenses, identify as capital or operating. You're also going to have to identify your assumptions as to where that data came from or how that data came to be created. So assumptions are going to be necessary. Then you aggregate the data. You manually administer surveys. You aggregate the responses for each of the structured questions. For open-ended questions, you're going to extract the content from each one, and we'll talk about that. Identify issues discussed on each survey. For similar issues, develop common wording and note how many respondents mentioned the issue. Determine the relevance of the issues of the research questions. If the surveys were administered via SurveyMonkey or other tools, very often those tools come with aggregators, but you still have to do content analysis for your open-ended questions. Interviews, focus groups, if close-ended questions, structured questions, aggregate the responses. Then you take your notes and your open-ended questions and do content analysis. For systems of records, for each data element extracted, you aggregate the content. For financial data or other content for developing pro forma estimates, organize the data by year for the planning horizon, and then determine the annual level of change over each year. After you've aggregated the data, you enter the data in Excel, and you use that to create tables and charts, right? So it's your logical stuff. Here's lots of examples of data and charts, and I'm going to skip through these. You've seen some of these in prior lectures, right? Then you analyze the data. For quantitative data, use appropriate analysis methods. Advanced statistical methods such as correlation or regression t-test are generally not used. Right, what we're really going to use is we're going to use descriptive statistics. They identify patterns among variables, analyze relationships, but for practical administrative research, managers want to understand what's causing the problem and how to solve it. So absenteeism is caused by various factors, including traffic congestion, child daycare needs, and lax policy towards absenteeism. That's what they want to hear. They don't want to hear like variable X has 1.6 and variable Y had a coefficient of 2.7. You know, they don't want to hear that stuff. And therefore, the regression equation is such and such. They want to know what's going on, what's the problem, how do I fix it? So how do we meet the quantitative research requirements of your capstone class? Stick with basic descriptive statistics, mean and standard deviation. For qualitative data, use content analysis. Okay, so we went through these slides earlier, right? Remember this? Mean, standard deviation. Means the arithmetic average of the scores for each question. Standard deviation is the variability of those scores across the 5 responses, right? So that's important, right? Here, this is the example I was telling you about in the prior lecture, right? Where maybe you have on one of your questions, do you think salary is a factor in turnover? All 14 respondents gave it a number 3. So what's the mean? What's the average? It's 3, right? Then here's another case where do you think salary is a factor in turnover? 7 people said no, absolutely not. And 7 people said yes, absolutely yes. What's the mean? It's still 3. So by saying a mean of 3, it doesn't work, right? You can't just say the mean of 3. In both cases, you have a mean of 3, but in one case you have a nice normal distribution, kind of a spiked mean. In the other case, it's bimodal, right? And so you can sort of see here the 2 different examples. I had a standard deviation of 0. There's no deviation from the mean, whereas on the right-hand side, I calculated a standard deviation of 7.48, which indicates there's high deviation from the mean. And so that standard deviation is useful. 0, it means it's clustered in the center. Large number means, away from the center, right? So it's high standard deviation. Anyway, stick with the basics. For Likert scale questions, use descriptive statistics, show the aggregated responses in the table, organize around the research questions, include the mean and standard deviation, right? Feasibility study, organize the data's revenue expenses, differentiate capital and operating expenses, use a multi-year model, 5 to 10 years. Carefully document your assumptions and your rationale for your estimates. Explain your basis for your annual increases in expenses and build your model, right? We saw that before when I went over quantitative analysis. Anyway, this is about the feasibility model. These are charts. Organizing and displaying all of your data, whether you're doing financial or non-financial analysis, using tables and charts. Make it look nice. For qualitative data, this is... I said you won't do qualitative research, but if you have an open-ended question, in a way, that is qualitative research, right? And so you have to appreciate that you have to go through and do content analysis. You have to sort of look for the themes, in each person's open-ended questions, and then kind of like shorten it to like 3 or 4, 5 words, little labels. And then you have to start count how many people came up with that comment in their open-ended questions. It's called frequency analysis, right? So this is how you do frequency analysis in Chapter 4. Content analysis, right? You can see that I went through the open-ended questions, and the question was, what other reasons do you think contributed to not completing your capstone in 16 weeks? And then people were writing, right? But they said procrastinated. There's that word. I found it in this one and that one and this one. Became involved in a new project at work. Birth of a new child and all that goes with it. Significant illnesses occurred during the first half of the semester. Loss of a loved one. Bored with the topics, so did not focus on getting data collected. And there's the frequency, right? So I've taken my open-ended question and converted it into a nice analytical, structured kind of a thing. Align the results with research questions. You remember that in Chapter 3, you built that table, right? So you have to orient Chapter 4 the same way. What you really want to do is you want to go through the questions on your survey that relate to sub-question 1 and answer those first, right? And then make sure that you explain things. You don't just write 6 people responded number 1, 7 people responded number 2. You got to say why. Why is the data distributed the way it is? Why is everybody negative, or why is everybody positive, or why are the responses kind of spread across all the answers? Why? What do you think? And it gives you finally your chance to put your own thoughts in there, right? To show how smart you are. So you have to explain the reasons for what's communicated in the data. And so it's important, this analysis. And lack of analysis in Chapter 4 is a good reason not to get an A. And I'd like to tell you, I'm a second reviewer on lots and lots and lots of capstone projects. And I will not give an A if there's no analysis in Chapter 4. So you have to have it. So anyway, develop effective transition from the first 3 chapters. This is from the template. I'm just going to show you the template, right? It tells you in the template what to do. Develop the chapter structure focused on answering the research questions. Analysis of how personal factors influence capstone completion. You see that down near the bottom of the page. So then there's your discussion and your charts and your discussion. Then analysis of how work-related factors influence capstone completion. And then there's narrative and charts and tables and stuff. Describe data displayed using written narrative, right? We talked about that. Use narrative to describe the data. As indicated in Table 1, more than 50% of the respondents feel that operational tempos had a dramatic impact. But then why? Also significant, okay, why? Right, analysis of how factors. So this, things to note, organized by research question. This is in the template. First question, so it briefly mentioned on the survey, but discuss the answers and talk about it. So that's just showing you how in the proposal template I've laid things out for you to follow. Okay, so, and don't forget, down below, you can see here, this suggests that, the data suggests, the data is consistent with and supported by literature, These are ways to analyze your data. Don't forget to do that. It's really important. Suggest that data is consistent with, just make sure you have analysis, right? So there's lots of examples, both in this presentation and in the proposal template. And then don't forget to write a summary at the end of the chapter. Why? Well, because there's a summary at the end of Chapter 2. Now you have a summary at the end of Chapter 4. When you write Chapter 5, there's a subsection called Summary. Summary of Chapter 2 and Summary of Chapter 4. So you write a nice summary here. What's the main things out of this chapter? And if you're able to do that, then you're all set to write Chapter 5. And then finally and importantly, have Chapter 4 edited. Okay, let's talk about Chapter 5 and the executive summary briefly. I know you're tired of listening to this lecture, and you're tired of this class, and you're tired of being in school, and you're tired of everything, right? But when students get to Chapter 5, they just want to get it done. So often I get like a 1-page or a 2-page Chapter 5, or I get the recommendations. The most important thing in the entire study, what the boss wants, is how to fix the problem. And the students have 1 paragraph, and like, bam, your A is gone. You're not getting an A. You want to have a powerful study. You have recommendations, you have them numbered, you have 3 to 5 recommendations, and you have some paragraphs explaining them. You have to do that. Don't run out of steam when you write this chapter. So what is the summary? The summary are the key facts from the literature and the data analysis. What are the conclusions? They're the answers to the research questions based on the facts from Chapters 2 and 4. And what are the recommendations? There are things that you've either gleaned from the literature, you gleaned from the data analysis, or you just want to throw in your own 2 cents, the recommendations. Then you have to go back and add the executive summary, right? So this is it. This is the end, right? So all this work that you did, Chapter 1 just set the study up. But Chapter 2, you gathered information from other studies. Chapter 4, you gathered original, primary, secondary data and analyzed those 2. And both of those Chapters 2 and 4 have summary, and you bring them together into Chapter 5, into the summary section. Summary of the literature and data analysis, conclusions, answers to the questions, and then finally, recommendations. Key elements of Chapter 5, Transition paragraphs discuss what's transpired. Summary of key points from literature and data analysis. Answers to the research questions and recommendations. Summary, summarize key points from literature. If Chapter 2 is a good summary of key points, that summary can be paraphrased here. If it doesn't, you have to go back and dig into all those details in Chapter 2, remember them, and then come up with your own new summary. And a summary of key points from data analysis. Well, you just finished Chapter 4, so you probably won't have any problems here. But if you have a good summary in Chapter 4, you don't have to do too much work. Conclusions. Research is evidence-based inquiry, right? We pose questions and seek facts. We gathered facts from literature and facts from data. We know that bias weakens research effectiveness, so we're not going to have any of that going on. So we answer the research questions in this section of Chapter 5, the conclusions section, using facts from 2 and 4. Recommendations. Include appropriate recommendations. They should be linked to and derived from the conclusions. Number the recommendations. For each recommendation, provide paragraphs explaining what's meant and how the organization or decision maker should go about implementing it. And then I like to see students add recommendations for future research. This is what researchers do. We kind of show where the research could go from here. So it's very useful to include that. It makes you seem like a real researcher. Then you go back and you write an executive summary. Executive summary can be no more than 2 pages. No more. Double spaced. So now that you've got Chapter 5 written, you can go back and you can say this research examined the following questions. And it studied the literature, and from the literature found the following. It also collected data, and from the data it determined that such and such. And in summary, 5 recommendations are included. Here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You don't have all the details in the executive summary. Make the person go to Chapter 5. But you got to have your recommendations listed in your executive summary. That's what the boss wants to read about, right? That's the high-level thing. Key considerations. Don't cut Chapter 5 too short. Yes, you're tired and excited to be almost done. Don't run out of steam yet. It's an important chapter. Imagine you have to present the study to senior leadership, but they don't have access to your earlier chapters. Write this chapter in a way that explains the whole study. Lay out the entire study. Don't forget to have everything edited. And that's the last slide. It was 71 slides. We did it in less than 30 minutes. I know I was in power mode, slamming through this stuff. Hope it's been helpful to you. I've enjoyed working with you this semester. I love teaching this class. I love teaching in general. I'm excited for you to finish your master's degree and then get back to me about a recommendation letter for your doctorate. Why should you get a doctorate? Because, when you get to your retirement age, if you're a school teacher or law enforcement or whatever, and you get to retire at age 48 or 49 or 50, your retirement's not going to be enough to live off of. So what could you do if you had a doctorate? You could teach. Does teaching pay good money? It pays enough money to be a great supplement for Social Security or for a retirement. So think about it. Take a little break and then give serious consideration to continuing your education. One thing they can never take away from you is your education, your degrees. They can't take them away. Once you've been conferred with a degree, it's yours for the rest of your life. Now, the last thing I ask you to do is think about your last name and put the word doctor in front of it. And I remember how cool it was the first time somebody called me Dr. Kessler. Oh, it's extremely cool. And you could do it. It takes a little bit of work, a little bit of dedication, extremely supportive family, and probably some finagling of finances, but something to think about. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next class. This is Dr. Tom Kessler.